Amen. Now, we are in week 3, the final week of our series where we've been looking at the life of Daniel, this hero or this person who lived in the Old Testament. And it's been a great series where we've kind of figured out, how do we look at this guy's life and figured out how does he thrive, not just survive, but thrive in Babylon and this city that took him over and brought him to their city. And it's been an interesting series because there's so many little keys that we need to pick up. It's not like our normal series where we have just one point kind of lock in, so it's a bit wider. But I think it's important as we go to look at his life to think about it where we are today and how do we relate to what's going on. I don't know if you experience this in your life. I'm going to assume you do, but how many of you have experienced change at some point in your life? Okay, cool. If you're not raising your hand, you're completely missing out on life because change is everywhere, right? Change happens as awesome as the faithfulness that we sang about from God, that it's like, hey, from the time the sun comes up till it's setting, great is your faithfulness. Well, his faithfulness needs to be great because that's about how often change happens. All the time to us, right? When you think about it, it hits us in our jobs. It hits us in our schools. You know that feeling when you're going from elementary school into middle school? That's a weird transition. Middle school into high school, you feel like you're going to be swallowed up, let alone college. And then after college, when you're trying to figure out what do you do for a job and all of these things. What about in our relationships? Have you ever been in a relationship and it didn't last? Okay, maybe just me. That happens. What do you do when that change comes? Change is everywhere. It happens when not only do you get married or if you have kids or if you move apartments, move houses, move a geography, you have money and then you stop having it because something changed in your job or a sickness happened that has taken it. Change happens all the time to us. And yet somehow we have to figure out, if change is always happening, how do I stay consistent as a follower of Jesus and not change with the changes and where that pressure is? Because that's what happens to most of us. Things change, and we begin to say, fine, I'll just change with what's happening. And sometimes I think God is calling us to consistency. Maybe we adapt, but we do not change. And how do we do that? You know, it's funny because at Crossbridge, we have change that's been happening and we've been talking about. You know, a couple months ago when we talked about that possible ministry center as the next direction, this was change for many of us. And we thought, oh, we'll give God our yes. And we did. And then very quickly, we realized we got a call about a possible merger with Southwood Church in West Deptford. And let me tell you, that's not change we expected. It's not change we were looking for, but we began to pray about this. And, you know, today, even after our time in the Word together, we're going to take some time together as a whole church to pray about this, because whenever change is coming, we need to pause and say, God, what do you want of us, of me in this moment? This is the story of Daniel. This is how he not only survived, but he thrived, because change happened to this guy all the time. Right? When we are introduced to Daniel in Daniel chapter 1, he's just a teenager who looks good, is fit, and he's smart. And the king of Babylon sees him, King Nebuchadnezzar, and he's like, I'll take that guy, send him through our school to learn all the things, because guys like that serve in my court. I want the best of the best. And so, you know, Daniel comes in and he serves in the court and he does all of the things that he's asked of. Last week, we heard about how Daniel was sitting out at his home when someone knocked on his door and a messenger came to say, hey, Daniel, sorry, but I got to come kill you. Time out. What? Why? Well, the king had a dream and he won't tell anybody what it is. And so if no one can tell him what the dream is and what it means, everybody just has to die. All of you magicians and wise men and stuff. Can I go see him? Sure. And he goes to see the king. He hears from the king. He goes back with his friends and he prays. Lord, would you give me the dream and the interpretation so I could tell him to serve him? And God does. And when he does, Nebuchadnezzar raises him up to be one of the highest people in the kingdom. And then we don't hear about Daniel for another 30 years until, obviously, the king has another dream. And in this dream, he explains it to all the wise men and all the magicians and enchanters and astrologers because he's so freaked out by it. He's like, all right, I can't do this. Someone needs to tell me. I'm not even playing the guessing game anymore. And it's not until Daniel comes in once again to interpret this for him. And he tells the king, I wish this was for anybody else but you. Which shows us that he has a relationship with the king, that he loves the king. And in that dream, he says to him, if you don't humble yourself before the creator of all the universe who has put you in the position that you're in, you are about to go crazy and be outside the city walls for 7 years eating grass like a wild animal until it finally clicks who you serve. And so, like all good kings in positions of power, he ignored it. And a year later, he was boasting about how amazing he was and the kingdom he built when the Lord said, enough's enough. And he went crazy, went outside, became a spectacle until it all clicked 7 years later, and he went, I get it. I get it. I was completely wrong, and he submitted his life to God, and he came back, and I absolutely love the summary of King Nebuchadnezzar's life at the end of chapter 4. This is what we read, the king saying about himself in chapter 4. The last two verses say, when my sanity returned to me, so did my honor and glory and kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored as the head of my kingdom with even greater honor than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and glorify and honor the King of heaven. All his acts are just and true, and he is able to humble the proud. Isn't that awesome? The king, this guy who is the ultimate in authority, submits to God, and he's like, I get that he wins. I got nothing on him. And when I finally submitted myself to that, he gave me my kingdom back, and even better than before. Now, if you were a citizen of that kingdom, tell me that wouldn't be a great place to live, where the king comes back and you're like, uh-oh, what's going to happen? Oh, he submitted himself to God, and he's proclaiming this peace, this justice, this goodness. And don't start boasting about who you are, because God will humble you quick. God does not bring us to faith to make us miserable. And I need you to hear me on that. There's so often we say when we follow Jesus, like, it's going to make your life better. It doesn't always make your life better. It makes it richer. It gives it purpose. But sometimes it's really hard to follow Jesus. Amen. It's just hard to follow Jesus. But he does not invite us and give us faith to follow him because he's like, now I want your life to be miserable. No, he actually allows us this grace and this faith to follow Jesus, to follow God, so that we can then be who God has created us to be. Not have to take on the lies of the world and everything that comes with it, because when we are trying to be the best that we can be, we're just going to fall short constantly and disappoint ourselves. So we have to lean into what God is doing in us and the power of the Holy Spirit in us. And what I love is that Daniel, even though he wasn't placing his faith in Jesus, because this is the Old Testament, he's placing his faith in God, and he's trusting what God says from the very, very beginning when he was even taken away from his land. He stayed faithful, consistent, and he worked so hard while he was in Babylon. And he worked for that kingdom just like he would have worked for God. Just like the prophet Jeremiah had told him to, like we talked about on week 1. But change happens, doesn't it? King Nebuchadnezzar is not going to stay king forever. He's the longest king in this dynasty of 43 years. He stays in his kingship, in this position of leadership for 43 years. And he was in this dynasty known as the best, most powerful king of Babylon. But after 43 years, his son, Marduk, he took over. And he took over for 2 years. 2 years because he was overthrown and murdered, which is not ideal if you want to stay in power. But this is the way power works in this area. And so what happened is he was actually murdered by his son-in-law. And when his son-in-law murdered him, he stole the throne. He reigned in this throne for 4 years. Then a relatively young king came through after that, and he was relatively young. Like if you actually look up this guy, his name, Labishi Marduk, which one is this one here? Yeah, Labishi Marduk. There's funky names. I'm skipping the ones that I'm really going to butcher. So if you're like, wait, he didn't say that other one. Yeah, there's a reason, okay? There's a reason. You can look it up. But this one, they always debate, was he just really, really young, or was he just young in the way that he led? They cannot figure this out based on the language that they have. But either way, he lasted about 1 to 3 months. He lasted 1 to 3 months because he was that bad of a leader. And it was this guy, I walk away for a second. Nabonidus. There we go. We're going to get rid of him in a second because he took over after 1 to 3 months and then was like, this is a lot. I'm going to take this and kind of divide it out a little bit. And his son, Belshazzar, kind of took over for him. He was this crown prince that began ruling as king in Babylon. And each king that took over after Nebuchadnezzar, they became less skilled. They became less popular. They became just less liked by everyone in this kingdom. And with every new king, do you know what happens when new kings come in? They get rid of the old, they bring in the new, right? We want people who are fresh and young and we can influence, and change is going to happen. Could you imagine serving as Daniel and then you're now 4 kings deep? Do you think you have a position anymore? Daniel actually, by the time we get to Belshazzar, isn't even on his radar. He doesn't even know Daniel exists anymore. He's so far gone. And this is one of those things that we need to understand if we want to survive and thrive in Babylon. This is one of those keys, is don't make your career, your job, or your profession into an idol. Be working to live rather living to work. This is very hard to say in the 21st century in the culture that we live in, because our titles, our jobs, our roles, what we do, we take so much identity from that. We take so much value from it, from the position that we are as people. And we sit there and we make these things our identity. We make them an idol. And that's why when we lose them, we begin to spiral out of control. When people lose a job that they have been working so hard for, and they finally have it, but then something went wrong and they lose it. I have sat with men and women at Crossbridge who have gone into depression over losing jobs. Not because they're not skilled and could get a job somewhere else, but because they have no idea who they are outside of that job. You see, they have been living to work, rather than allowing work to be the gift that it is, to earn a living so that you can serve. Daniel could have fallen into this. He's going to be forgotten, but he didn't. And in chapter 5, this is what we pick up in his story. It says, many years later, King Belshazzar gave a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he drank wine with them. And while Belshazzar was drinking the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver cups that his predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. If you remember, that's in chapter 1. He took all that stuff with him. He wanted to drink from them with his nobles, his wives, and his concubines. So they brought these gold cups taken from the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines drank from them. And while they drank from them, they praised their idols made of gold and silver and bronze and gold and wood and stone. My man is partying. He is excited, and he's like, let's break out the good stuff. Let's get the best goblets that we know how. And what you're missing, I didn't tell you this. Babylon's not nearly as strong as it was. And right outside the doors of this massive city with hundreds of gates, the Euphrates River sliding right through it, is the Persian army. The Persian army has come to their door, and they are waiting to take over Babylon. They are about to take them over. And so when you have big problems that come your way and you are the leader, what do you do? Well, if you're a bad leader, you throw a party for 1,000 people to show off. You don't pay attention to what's outside. Oh, no, that'll solve itself, right? No, it won't. But that's how bad of a leader Belshazzar is. He goes and he's like, let's take out these great gold cups. It's like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? Just get red Solo cups or something. Like, bad choice. You could throw them out. Like, you made a bad choice. But he did this to impress everybody. And then he takes these sacred cups and they begin to praise the idols that have no voice, that have no eyes, that have no ears, that they've created themselves. You know, God's not going to settle and let this be okay, because these were sacred instruments used in the worship of him, and they were taken away, and they were meant to be in the temple. God will not allow this. And so in a way that I wish that I could imagine in my head, I just cannot frame this. In the midst of the party, on the plaster walls, a hand, disembodied, appears. And it begins to write and carve out words in the plaster. And it writes word after word after word. There's 4 words that are there. And when we read in Daniel, we read that the king is so terrified he loses all color. And obviously everybody else freaks out too. It seems like an appropriate response, correct? If we all just saw an disembodied hand start writing on the gym wall. Who else is freaking out? Okay, cool, great, thank you. We're not crazy, but they all do. And it says like the king, his legs became weak. He just drops and he's like, I can't do this. So he calls all the magicians, all the astrologers, all the wise men that he can around, and he's like, guys, you got to tell me what this means. And they all look at it and they're like, ugh, I got nothing. And he's like, I will make whoever can figure this out and tell me what this means. I'll make him the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. And so we read in verse 7 of chapter 5, it says, the king shouted for the enchanters, the astrologers, the fortune tellers to be brought before him. He said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever can read these writings, tell me what it means. We'll be dressed in purple robes of honor, purple robes of royal honor, and I will have a gold chain placed around his neck. He will become the 3rd highest in the kingdom. He's there. He's like, yes. But he doesn't call Daniel at all. Do you know why? Because Daniel's nothing to him. Daniel's gone. Daniel's the old guard. And so as King Belshazzar's freaking out, the queen mother hears that her grandson here is freaking out. And so she then goes to this party and she's like, what's your deal? He's like, look. And she's like, man, don't you remember King Nebuchadnezzar had a guy named Daniel? This guy had the spirit of the gods living in him. And why don't you call for him? He'll come do this. He did this for King Nebuchadnezzar, remember? So they call for Daniel. Daniel comes in. And he says to Daniel, if you could do this, same deal, 3rd highest. Can I tell you, I just love Daniel's response. He comes out of nowhere, Mr. Obscurity. And in verse 17, this is what he says to the king. Daniel answered the king, keep your gifts or give them to someone else. Like, doesn't matter to me. But I will tell you what that writing means. How cool is this? You're trying to incentivize a position. Don't care, man. Don't care. When I was called upon before, I did my job because that's what I was asked to do. I would do the same for you. I don't need incentivizing. I don't need this. All your gold, all that stuff, you can give it to whoever you want. Doesn't mean anything to me. And so what he does is he tells the king, listen, do you remember what happened to King Nebuchadnezzar? I know you forgot. So I'll remind you, he was proud and he was arrogant and the Lord humbled him. Do you remember that? And then he had to go outside the city and he was like an animal because the Lord had to humble him because he was too proud. He kept on sinning. He was a horrible, horrible leader until he submitted to God. And you knew that, Belshazzar. You knew it. And you didn't do anything. And when he finally submitted to God, God gave everything back to him. Do you remember when he came back on the throne? But you haven't listened. You haven't respected God. And that's what this is all about. That's what these words are all about. Now, please remember, King Belshazzar asked Daniel what this meant. We do not get to go and just blurt out all of these things to bosses when we see something that's wrong, okay? But he was asked for his opinion. this is a key for us if we're going to survive, is that remembering what God has done builds faith and confidence. Keep telling others about how he's moved in your life. We need to continue to tell the story of God everywhere we go because we just sang about how great his faithfulness is. And we need to be reminded of that constantly. And we need to do that because it builds our faith when we remember how good he is, how great he is, how holy he is, and yet how intimate and lost in his love we can be. And then we need to be reminding others of it because, let's just be honest, we forget really quick, don't we? We need to be reminded of this. And now Daniel's in a place where he doesn't just throw it in. He's invited to speak on this. And so he does. And then he says, and let me tell you what this meaning is. Your days are numbered, Belshazzar. Your actions have not measured up with what a king should look like. And so your kingdom is about to be divided. It's going to be given to the Medes and the Persians. Do you remember who's outside? Who's outside the city? Persians are outside the city. The Persians are sitting outside the city. And Belshazzar would not make it through the night. Verse 30 says, that very night, Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, was killed. I love this. Not like... It's October 12th, 539 BCE. We know the date this happens because of the history that the Babylonians and the Persians and the Medes had kept. It's October 12th, and King Cyrus, the king of the Persian army, he's ready to take Babylon, this city. They're camped outside the walls. They're ready for battle, but they never made a move. Do you know why? Because the walls of Babylon were considered impenetrable. And the only way that you could get into the city was maybe trying to take one of the gates that were around, but those were all guarded. Maybe you could get through the Euphrates River, like I said, went through the city, but they had these huge grates that protected it. Think of Helm's Deep from Lord of the Rings. Any dorks with me? There's a little grate the only way in, okay? And if you don't know what that means... read books and watch a movie, please. It's so good. It'll help you understand Daniel. Listen, so here's what happened that night. King Cyrus showed off the Persian engineering and strategy in a way that was unheard of. Upstream, he had his armies figure out a way to divert the Euphrates River. So the Euphrates River kind of started going a different direction, which lowers down the water level that's going into the city. And these guys literally marched in right under the gates and took over the city. That night, they assassinated King Belshazzar. And when the king came in, and now King Cyrus is going to put himself on the throne, you'd expect that there would be more fighting in the city and raising in the city. There's nothing like that. Do you know why? Because the Babylonians hated their king. And when King Cyrus came in, they were like, oh, thank gods, you're here. We hated that guy. And King Cyrus does not go annihilating everybody. He doesn't go and try to wipe them out and make it. They actually come in and they're so excited he's there. He's like, this is great. And there's really a lot of people here. So anybody that we've taken as POWs over the last couple of decades, if you'd like to go home, you can. And so there's about 50,000 Israelites, 50,000 Hebrews who are like, shotgun, we'll go home. And you can read about that with Ezra. And they say, all right, we're going to go. And they go back to Jerusalem. Daniel is not one of them. He's there in the city and he stays. But remember, he was placed third in command. Do you think he's worried about his life at this point? Would you be? I would. New boss. It's a lot of change. You're on the wrong side of a takeover. But you know what's the same? His God. And who he is has not changed. And when we get to chapter 6, Darius is king. And he makes a pretty strategic move. Check this out in the verse 3 verses. It says, Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each of the provinces. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officials and to protect the king's interests. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. And because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. Doesn't this sound exactly like what happened with King Nebuchadnezzar? Do you know why that this keeps happening? Is because even a pagan king knows quality when he sees it. We keep going back to this. Even a pagan king knows quality when he sees it. Daniel has just done what he has always done. He puts his head down. He works hard. Each day, work for God. Can I just tell you, each day, work for God. You'll stand out. You'll stand out at work. Just work for your boss as if you were working for God. And if you're like, how do I even know if I'm doing that? Here's some questions you can ask yourself. Like, does your boss trust you? How do you know? Do you work hard when you're not being managed? When someone's not going to look at your hours or your clock or are you working hard then? Do you tell the truth at work? Ooh, that was a hard one, wasn't it? You like to use sick days as like vacation days if it's not just general paid time off and you're like, yep, day off, gotta go golfing. Work hard. Be trustworthy. I want to tell you, today, it's typical. I'd even say I think it's expected for employees, for students in school, to slack off, to try to work the system that's over them. Right? That's why we have employee handbooks that are like larger than our Bible at times. And every detail's in there, and you got to read through it all to try to figure out what can you do and can't you do. Why? Because every time they write a rule, it's in response to something someone did, right? Every sign is there for a purpose. Every rule is there because there's been something behind it. And the employer has to try to protect themselves from employees trying to take advantage of them, to beat the system. The more rule breakers that are around, the more rules we're going to have. And as a follower of Jesus, this is not how we should be living. Are you with me on that? We should be working hard. We should be trustworthy. Here's 3 simple rules for you to follow at work or at school. 3 simple rules. You probably won't ever have to read an employee handbook for the rest of your life. The first one is tell the truth. Tell the truth. No like ifs, ands, buts. Just tell the truth. Work hard. Treat everyone with respect. I promise you, you do these, you will not break any of the things that are in your employee handbook. Seriously, tell the truth. Work hard. Treat everyone with respect. You will avoid so much trouble from your boss, from your teachers, from your coaches. However, you will catch some garbage from your coworkers and friends. Because when you continue to live faithfully, consistently, and loving others as Jesus has called us to live, it will be noticed by people over us, but it will create a new feeling in those around us sometimes, especially those who don't follow Jesus. And that feeling is jealousy. That's what usually comes up, and Daniel experiences it. Verse 4, it says, then the other administrators and the high officers began searching for some fault in the way that Daniel was handling the government affairs, but they couldn't find anything, to criticize him or condemn him. He was faithful, always responsible, completely trustworthy. You see, when God is your boss and integrity is your mode of operation, it's really tough for critics, for rivals, and for enemies to find dirt on you. And the thing is, corrupt and jealous people will not give up easily. They will come in and they will try to find things to just get you. They are resilient. If they worked just as hard at how they were getting you at their jobs, they wouldn't have this problem, right? But they're creative. And so they find ways to get us into trouble, which is exactly what happens to Daniel. You know the story. It says that we're all in agreement. We administrators, high officials, they go to the king and they say this, to the advisors and the governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. This is your lion story. This is what we know from Daniel, right? But the king is down with this. He's like, sweet, pray to no one but me? I'm in. I mean, who's not going to want that? And so he signs it. It's away. It goes. But the only way that the administration here knows they can get to Daniel is to go through his faith. And here's the tough part is at this point, Daniel's probably in his 80s. I mean, so many things have come down the line for him that he's had to deal with. And of all the crazy things that kings have said, can I tell you, I think this one is the easiest one for him to obey. Because there is nothing in here that says you have to worship the king. It says that you can't pray to someone or something else unless it's the king. Right? There's a huge difference. It's illegal to pray to someone else for 30 days, but there's not a mandate to worship the king. Does that make sense? They're very, very different. What makes this kind of dirty is it put Daniel in a position where he had to deny God and say, for 30 days, I won't be in relationship with you. I will ignore you just to get through this. And in verse 10, it just says, when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home. He knelt down as usual in his upstairs room, and with his windows open towards Jerusalem, he prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to God. He had a habit that he didn't break. It was a private, routine, daily prayer time with God. There was no complaining about King Darius and his decree. There's no, God, this isn't fair, and this is dumb. And it just tells us that he went and he consistently gave thanks to God. You see, this is a key for us if we're going to survive. We need to develop a routine prayer life that is filled with thanksgiving. We need to develop a routine prayer life filled with thanksgiving. And that's what Daniel does. He's all over praying for thanksgiving, and then his enemies are all over him. They bring him, and they go to the king, and they knew what he was going to do, and they kind of hold him off for a second, and they go to the king, and they're like, hey, king, do you remember the awesome decree you signed? He's like, yeah, the one that says praise me. He's like, I love this. Yeah, that one. Man, that's going to be a big one, but do you think there's any way around this? Like, can we get, we know you signed it. He's like, no way, man. When we sign it, it's law. 30 days, nothing. They're like, good, we found someone who's been doing it. Who? We found a guy. This guy named Daniel. You know, he's one of those exiles. They were trying to explain to Darius who Daniel was like they didn't know. And like he didn't know. Isn't that crazy? They were playing like they didn't understand. In verse 14, it says, hearing this, the king, he becomes deeply troubled, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. He spent the rest of the day looking for a way to get Daniel out of this predicament. You see, his reaction to the news that just was put before him shows his level of respect, his admiration, his care for Daniel. This mattered to him. He was trying to figure out how to help him, but law was law. And so Darius has no way out of this. He has to follow through. And he's ordered 80-year-old Daniel to be lowered into a lion's den. Daniel doesn't freak out. He doesn't go nuts. We read nothing like that, which is a key for us. We need to handle unfair situations with a humble and Christ-like attitude. Guess what? Life is unfair, Crossbridge. Surprise, isn't it? Life is unfair. You could do all the right things and still get fired. You could study all night long and still fail that test. I wish life was fair. It's not. And so how we handle ourselves in those situations really matters. Will we be humble? Will we have a Christ-like attitude? And just before he's lowered in, the king says to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. Daniel's trapped, and so is King Darius. He's got authority, he's got wealth, but he's helpless. He didn't ditch Daniel. He didn't go, oh, I don't want to deal with this and go sit in the castle. Actually, he's there until the very moment that Daniel is lowered down and everyone's watching. And now here's the king feeling helpless before this, saying, I hope your God rescues you while everyone's there for the spectacle. This isn't a good look for the king, but he doesn't care. And Darius is stuck because of his own decree. And now, likely for the very first time, Daniel and the king are relying on the same God for help. Because Darius can't go to another shrine. He can't go to another idol. He can't do anything because of his own decree. He's stuck. And he knows that he's helpless. And so he says to Daniel, may your God rescue you. And at the crack of dawn, after a night of fasting and pacing, he doesn't sleep. And he races out to the lion's den. He gets to the lion's den and he yells out, "Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God whom you serve so faithfully able to rescue you from the lions? Like, are you okay? Are you okay?" And I imagine just leaning in and going, "Say something. Say anything. Anything. Concern, straining." And Daniel answers in verse 21. He says, "Long live the king." The first response isn't, "Yes, I'm safe." The first response from Daniel is respect. "Long live the king. My God sent his angels to shut the lion's mouth so that they would not hurt me, for I have been found innocent in his sight. And I have not wronged you, your majesty." He doesn't speak to the king like, "You jerk. You left me in here so long." No, he says, "Honor you, king. Long life to you. Bless you. I want you to know I didn't do anything wrong to you either. My God has saved me, and I'm respecting you." No condemnation that way. No making sure, "Don't ever do this again to me. Remember, those guys are dumb. They're idiots. They just keep lying to you." You know, so often we tell this story of Daniel and the lions, then God rescued Daniel from the lion. Great. But he has rescued him from king after king after king through change. And he has allowed him to live a life of consistency and honor and respect. Why? Because day after day, I think Daniel was living out the very thing we talked about on week 1 that Jeremiah told them to do. In Jeremiah 29, he simply told them this. "This is what the Lord of heaven's army says, the God of Israel. To all the captives he has exiled to Babylon from Jerusalem. Build homes and plan to stay. Plant gardens and eat the food they produce. Marry and have children and then find spouses for them so that you may have grandchildren. Multiply. Don't dwindle away." And it's likely that Daniel was not able to marry, that he did not have kids, but he was able to establish himself in this kingdom. And he took the last portion of what Jeremiah says, when Jeremiah says, "And work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord for it. For its welfare will determine your welfare." Daniel lived with integrity. He worked hard for whomever the king was, like he was working for God. He was consistent, he was faithful, he was prayerful, he was submissive. And as followers of Jesus today, if you have placed your faith in Jesus, I think that we are called to a life that looks so different than sometimes the way that we live. That we are called to a life that won't match the world around us. It's exactly why I asked Matthew to read that passage from 1 Peter for us today. I'm going to ask that you would stand with me as we read this again. This is the Apostle Peter writing to churches who are deeply persecuted, and his words to them, I think, are for us. This is what he says. "Now, who will want to harm you if you're eager to do good? But even if you suffer for doing what's right, God will reward you for it. So don't worry or be afraid of their threats. Instead, you must worship Christ as Lord of your life. And if someone asks you about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. But do this with a gentle and respectful way. Keep your conscience clear. Then if people speak against you, they will be ashamed when they see what a good life you live because you belong to Christ. Remember, it is better to suffer for doing good, if that is what God wants, than to suffer for doing wrong." Crossbridge, how do you live? How do we live? The Word of God that we stand for and respect calls us to a life so different than the people around us. A life where we are praying for, not against people. A life where we are serving, not taking. Where we are elevating those around us, not promoting ourselves. A life where we are so eager and excited to share the hope that we have in Jesus, but gently and respectfully. When's the last time someone asked you about Jesus because of the way that you lived? We got to stop saying things like, "We'll live in such an honoring way so that people will know the gospel and I'll never have to say it." Let me tell you, if we're living in a Christ-honoring way together, people will ask what's so different. When's the last time you were asked? because we get to share the hope that we have that Christ has given me freedom to do different. And we will suffer for what's doing right, which is better than suffering when we act like idiots, isn't it? And in that, we can be thankful. Are you with me? You may be seated.